Nothing was wrong with Gideon Shaw's Stallion. He was the best horse Gideon had raised in 12 years. Yet Gideon sold him because a grass fire had taken the winter hay, and 3 children who were not his own were sleeping under his roof. By noon, half of Red Willow Crossing had decided Gideon Shaw had finally lost his judgment. Martha Bellamy feared something worse. She feared that one day he would find it again, count what she and her children had cost him, and wish he had never opened his door. 8 months earlier, Martha had arrived in western Dakota Territory with 1 trunk, 3 children, and enough cash to last perhaps 6 weeks if nobody got sick and nothing broke. Nothing about that arithmetic made her proud. It simply made her careful. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a mill accident back in Iowa. The shop he had partly owned was swallowed by debts Martha had never known existed. By the time the accounts were settled, she had no house, no business, and no piece of land to hand down to the children. What she still had, Alice, who was 12 and had learned to watch adults before trusting them. Henry was 9 and could not pass a horse without asking 3 questions about it. Sam was 6 and still woke some nights expecting to hear his father's boots in the hall. Martha's cousin had written from Red Willow Crossing that work could be found there, and work was what Martha came for. She did not come west looking for a husband. That mattered to her. At the small boarding house where her cousin rented 2 rooms, Martha learned that Gideon Shaw needed help with his ranch books. His hired men could stack hay, break horses, mend harness, and argue about weather with great confidence. But none of them had ever made peace with columns of figures. Martha had kept the accounts in her husband's shop for 7 years. She met Gideon at the feed store on her 3rd day in town. He was 40, broad through the shoulders, sunbrowned, and quieter than the men who usually wanted a stranger to know what they owned. He asked Martha 3 questions about freight charges, winter feed, and unpaid accounts. She answered all 3, then corrected a mistake on the page he had brought with him. Gideon studied the number. "You certain?" "No," Martha said. "I crossed out your figure for the pleasure of being wrong in public." For the first time, he smiled. He offered her 6 weeks of work, bringing the ranch ledger back into order. There was a small line cabin near the main house that had once belonged to a married foreman. The roof was sound. The stove smoked only when the wind came hard from the north. She and the children could use it while she worked. Martha accepted the wages and refused the favor. "Take the cabin out of my pay," she told him. Gideon frowned. "It is standing empty." "Empty things still belong to somebody." He looked at her for a moment, then wrote a modest rent into the ledger. That was the first reason Martha trusted him at all. He had not argued that she was foolish. He had not insisted on generosity she had not asked for. He had let her keep the dignity of a bargain. The children took longer. Alice believed any arrangement could change the moment an adult found it inconvenient. She had watched creditors walk through their old home and put chalk marks on furniture while her mother stood silent beside them. To Alice, ownership was not an idea. It was the difference between what stayed and what vanished. Henry fell in love with the ranch before he liked the rancher. He followed the horses with the concentration of a small surveyor. Gideon finally handed him a brush and told him that questions were easier to tolerate if the boy's hands were working while he asked them. Sam kept close to Martha and spoke little around Gideon. Gideon did not force him. Instead, he gave the boy one small job that required no conversation. Each evening before supper, somebody had to strike the iron triangle outside the main house so the hands would come in from the far pens. Gideon showed Sam where the striker hung, then walked away. For nearly a week, Sam would not touch it. On the 8th evening, the triangle rang across the yard before Gideon reached the porch. Gideon came inside as if nothing unusual had happened. That was enough. By June, the 6 weeks had become 12. Martha had found money hiding everywhere in Gideon's books. Not stolen money, lost money. Freight paid twice. Feed charges never matched against delivery. 2 buyers who had carried balances so long the ranch had begun treating their debts like weather. She made lists. She sent letters. She organized receipts by month instead of by whichever pocket Gideon had emptied last. Within a season, he knew more about the actual condition of his ranch than he had known in years. He told her so without turning it into a compliment about how useful women could be. "You made the place legible," he said. Martha remembered that line because it was the first time in 2 years anyone had spoken of her skill without adding pity to it. The work changed the way they spoke to each other. At first, their conversations ended with figures. Then they began to include weather, children. Books, fences, and the small humiliations people admitted only after they stopped performing for one another. One evening in July, Martha found Gideon repairing the lower creek gate with Henry holding the lantern. The boy had left that same gate unlatched the day before. A young mare had pushed through, cut herself on broken wire, and come back bleeding along one flank. Henry had been sick with fear. He expected Gideon to send him away from the horses for good. Instead, Gideon made him clean the wound under supervision, then walk the fence line and find the place where the loose wire had begun. "A mistake gets expensive when you hide from it," Gideon told him. "So don't hide." Henry did not. He stayed until the mare was settled, then spent 2 hours the next morning tightening every latch he could reach. Martha watched the whole thing without interrupting. That night she asked Gideon why he had been so calm. He sat on the cabin step, elbows on his knees. "Because frightened boys don't learn much from frightened men." Then after a while he told her about his sister. Her name was May. Years earlier, before Gideon owned the ranch, their father had ruled it as though every fence post carried the family name. May married a freight driver he considered beneath her. When the marriage went bad and she returned asking for a place to stay, their father refused to let her come home unless she left her husband permanently and apologized for shaming the family. May refused the terms. Gideon had been 23, old enough to know his father was wrong, young enough, he said, to hide behind the fact that it was not yet his house. May left, she survived, so did her little daughter, but she never again called the ranch home, and she barely spoke to Gideon for more than 15 years. "I kept telling myself I had no authority," Gideon said. "Truth was, I had no courage." Martha looked toward the dark line of the pasture. "You were afraid of losing your place here." "Yes." "And did keeping it feel worth the price?" He did not answer. He did not need to. That was the first night Martha understood the ranch was not merely land to him. It was also evidence of one decision he wished he had made differently. It did not make her trust him completely, but it explained something about the care he took when a child made a mistake. By late summer, Red Willow Crossing had noticed Martha too. Some people assumed she and Gideon were already courting. Others decided she was clever enough to make sure that happened. A widow with 3 children and no property of her own gave bored neighbors plenty of arithmetic to perform. Martha heard most of it. She ignored what she could. What she could not ignore was the way Gideon had begun walking to the line cabin after supper and sitting on the step until the light failed. Sometimes Alice read nearby. Sometimes Henry interrupted every 5 minutes. Sometimes Sam fell asleep with his head against Martha's side. There was nothing elegant about it. That was part of what made it dangerous to her. She could imagine wanting it, and wanting it meant imagining the day it might be taken away. Gideon finally asked her one evening whether she had considered staying after the books were finished. Martha answered carefully, "As your bookkeeper, as whatever we decide this is becoming." She did not let him make the answer easy. "I have 3 children, Gideon. They are not luggage I can leave outside a marriage. They are not a debt I expect a man to pay off. And they are not guests who can be sent elsewhere when the house feels crowded." "I know. You know it tonight," he heard the warning inside the sentence. "What would make you believe I could know it later?" Martha looked at him for a long time. So he gave her time. Then August came dry. The grass went pale along the western fields. Creeks narrowed. Men began checking the horizon whenever the wind rose. The fire started after lightning struck open range several miles south of the Shaw place. At first it was a line of smoke. Then the wind turned. By mid-afternoon, Gideon's hired men were cutting fire breaks with every tool they had. The main haystack stood on the south side of the ranch, close enough to the advancing fire that there was still a chance to save them if the men concentrated there. The line cabin stood east of the stacks. So did the main house, the barn, the well, and the 3 Bellamy children. Martha had already loaded blankets, account books, and a small box of family papers into a wagon. She was ready to take the children north if the fire crossed the creek. Gideon rode in from the south, blackened with dust and smoke. One of the hands shouted that they could still save the largest haystack if everybody moved now. Gideon looked at the fire, then at the houses. "Leave the hay," he said. "Cut the line around the buildings." The hand stared at him. "That is our winter. Then we will buy winter somewhere else. Move." They saved the houses, they saved the barn, they saved the well and most of the corrals. The fire took nearly all the stacked hay and scorched enough grazing land to make the loss worse than it first appeared. No one died, no child was hurt, But the ranch entered September with livestock to feed, and not nearly enough feed to carry them through a Dakota winter. This was the part of frontier stories people often skipped. Survival did not end when the flames did. The bill arrived afterward. Hay prices climbed as every burned-out rancher searched for the same limited supply. Gideon could sell a portion of his herd, but selling too many breeding animals would cripple the next season. He could borrow against the ranch, but the terms offered in town would leave little room for another bad year. Or he could sell the Stallion. The horse was the center of a breeding line Gideon had spent years building. Selling him would bring enough money to buy feed, coal, flour, and the other things the household needed through winter. It would also set the horse operation back several seasons. Martha understood the figures before Gideon said them aloud. She closed the ledger. "The children and I will go back to town." Gideon did not answer immediately. "You heard me," she said. "I heard you. You have fewer mouths here. Your money lasts longer. I can find work at the boarding house through winter. And Alice leaves the school she just started. Henry leaves the horses. Sam goes back to sleeping in one room with 5 people because somebody somewhere decided that is the sensible calculation." Martha's jaw tightened. "Do not make my children the reason you ruin your ranch." "I'm not. Then what are you doing?" Gideon leaned both hands on the table, deciding what the ranch is for. 3 days later, he took the Stallion to auction. That was the morning the buyer asked what was wrong with the horse. Nothing was wrong. Gideon sold him at a fair price, paid for winter hay from a ranch farther north, and arranged freight before the first hard freeze. The sale did exactly what he needed it to do. It did not perform a miracle. He still had to reduce the herd. He postponed a new barn roof. 2 hired men left because he could no longer guarantee work through winter. The ranch survived smaller than it had been before the fire. That limitation mattered. Martha would not have trusted a story in which love somehow erased the arithmetic. Instead, she watched Gideon accept the cost without using it as a weapon. He never once told the children what the Stallion had bought. Henry found out from someone in town. For 2 days, the boy barely spoke. Then he went to Gideon and offered him the silver dollar he had saved from summer chores. Gideon looked at the coin in Henry's palm. "What's this for?" "The horse. That dollar will not buy him back." "I know. Then keep it." Henry closed his fingers around the coin, but he did not move. "Did you sell him because of us?" Gideon considered the question. "I sold him because I needed winter feed, and because I had people here I intended to get through winter. You are one of those people, that is all." Henry nodded once. For the first time he called Gideon by his first name instead of Mr. Shaw. Martha heard it from the doorway. She said nothing. That night, after the children were asleep, she carried the ledger to Gideon's kitchen and opened it between them. The Stallion had bought them time. It had not solved everything. The numbers still showed a narrow winter, and Martha refused to let Gideon's sacrifice become a new kind of debt hanging over her family. "You made one decision," she said. "Now let me make mine." She had already spoken with the owner of the general store. His books were nearly as bad as Gideon's had been. He would pay her to straighten them 2 afternoons each week. The school clerk also needed help copying tuition and supply accounts before the winter term. It was not enough money to restore the horse operation, but it was enough to cover coal, lamp oil, and part of the flour bill. Gideon started to object. Martha stopped him. "If you mean what you say about us being here, then stop treating contribution as something only you are allowed to make." He closed his mouth. She turned the ledger around. "I will keep working here. I will keep paying the cabin rent until something changes between us, in fact, not just in conversation. My wages from town go toward household expenses. Alice can help me with the copying, but only if it does not pull her from school. Henry keeps his chores. Sam keeps being sick." Gideon's mouth twitched at that. "And what do I do?" "Learn to let a family help save itself." That was harder for him than selling the Stallion had been. He had spent years believing responsibility meant carrying every weight before anyone could accuse him of failing. Martha understood the impulse because she had lived inside its opposite, years of having decisions made over her head because she owned too little to be consulted. Neither habit made a partnership, so they made a new account in the ledger, not charity, not rent, household. Martha's town wages went into it. Gideon entered grocery and coal costs. Alice copied receipts in a careful hand. When Henry earned coins helping a neighbor stack cordwood, Martha made him keep most of them, but he insisted on buying a sack of sugar for Christmas. By December, the account had become less important for the money inside it than for what it forced all of them to practice. Nobody was a guest, nobody was a rescuer. Every person who could carry something carried it. The winter was hard but ordinary in the ways that mattered most. Water froze. Harness cracked, the stove smoked. Alice learned enough bookkeeping to catch one of Gideon's errors and enjoyed the victory for a week. Henry took responsibility for the lower creek gate. Sam began running out to strike the dinner triangle without being asked, and he stopped asking when they would have to leave. Martha and Gideon did not become romantic heroes under the snow. They became dependable. He learned which child needed quiet and which needed work. She learned when his silence meant anger, and when it meant he was trying not to speak before he understood himself. They argued about money twice. They argued about Henry riding a young gelding once. They argued about whether Gideon should write to May. On that last point, Martha did not let him hide. "You keep saying the worst thing your father did was make the ranch more important than his daughter," she told him. "But you still live with the result as if it cannot be changed." So Gideon wrote. He did not ask May to forgive him. He told her what he should have told her 15 years earlier, that the door had been hers too, and he had been a coward when he failed to say it. Her answer did not arrive for 6 weeks. It was not warm. It was not cruel either. She wrote that she had spent too many years learning not to need that house to pretend one letter could make it home again. But she also wrote that her daughter wanted to meet the uncle who had finally learned to write the truth. That spring, when the roads became passable, May came to Red Willow Crossing for 3 days. She did not sleep in the main house. She chose the line cabin. Gideon did not argue. On the second evening, Alice found him and May sitting outside with coffee between them, speaking quietly about their mother. No grand reconciliation occurred. Something smaller did. May came back the following autumn. Martha understood then that Gideon's choice after the fire had changed more than the size of his horse herd. He had stopped using inherited property as an excuse for inherited behavior, and that mattered to her more than the sale itself. When Gideon asked again what would make her believe he could still know, years from now, that her children were not guests, Martha gave him a different answer. "Put it somewhere your future self has to argue with." He smiled because he understood her. The next week they rode into town. Gideon met with a lawyer and made a new will. He named Alice, Henry, and Sam alongside any children he and Martha might someday have. The language was plain enough that there would be no room for a later relative to pretend the Bellamy children had only been passing through his household. Martha read the document before he signed it. "You do not have to do this before we are married," she said. "That is why I am doing it before we are married." The lawyer looked from one of them to the other and decided not to comment. Gideon signed. Martha did not cry. She had spent too much of her life distrusting promises to be moved by ink alone. But the ink did not stand alone. Behind it stood a burned hayfield, a sold stallion, a smaller herd, a repaired relationship with a sister, months of ordinary meals, arguments, chores, mistakes, and children who had stopped asking when they would be sent away. That was enough. Martha married Gideon in May, after the spring grass came in. There was no grand celebration. Red Willow Crossing supplied a small meal, 2 cakes that did not match, and more chairs than Gideon's kitchen could hold. May attended with her daughter. Alice stood beside Martha. Sam fell asleep before the last guests left. Henry disappeared after supper. Gideon found him at the lower creek pasture with a wrench and a new iron latch. The old gate, the one Henry had once left loose, the one that had taught him how expensive a hidden mistake could become, was sagging again. Henry had taken it apart without being asked. Gideon leaned on the fence and watched him tighten the last bolt. "Needed fixing?" he asked. Henry tested the latch once, then a second time. "It is ours," he said.